War, natural disasters, shootings, murder and death. These are some of the things we hear or read about on our televisions, radios, newspapers and online. These stories are brought to us by journalists who often enter the scenes of these incidents to speak to survivors or relatives of the affected, sometimes even putting their own lives on the line. We've all heard the stories of soldiers who can't sleep after being on the front lines in the likes of the Middle East, and people who work in emergency services who turn to alcohol in order to escape the dark thoughts in the back of their minds. But we rarely hear about how these traumatic events affect reporters. I travelled all over the UK to speak to journalists about their stories, how they've been affected by trauma, and how they have coped following these situations. My first stop was Glasgow, where I spoke with Ian Dunn and Suzanne Lord, both of whom have had extensive experience in journalism and have covered their fair share of traumatic events.
And I covered the Anders Breivik shooting in Norway. Again, it was we were sent the day after. We were at the lake where it all happened, and then we were moved to Oslo, and we were outside the cathedral in Oslo, and I've never seen flowers like it.
There's one trip in particular I did with Skiaf, and we went about 3-4 years ago, and it was into Congo and Rwanda, and we're in the eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, and this is a place where, I mean, we were there just to the end, I reckon like 20-25 years of conflict.
The smell was so pungent, and people were consoling one another, and we spoke to survivors of it who were like, we were hiding behind a rock. You know, we thought he was coming for us, and it's when you hear stories like that, but when you hear them, you know, over several days, you know, it can build up really, and so it can be harrowing.
So you go around and you're interviewing people who, you know, there's a kind of epidemic of rape. Rape was used as a weapon of war, so you're interviewing women who have been, you know, raped dozens of times. You're people, you know, family, you know, parents who have lost like 6 or 7 children in conflict. You know, I mean, it's real. And as a journalist, you're going in, and it's the thing where you have to, you meet someone and you're like, right, tell me the worst thing that's ever happened to you.
You know, when you're covering it and you're in the heat of the moment, it's fine, but it's the few days later when you're still there trying to mop up the rest that you start thinking really about what happened, and you see all the flowers that have been brought in tribute and things like that.
You know, unless you're a sociopath, like how can you not, and if you're a good journalist, like you're making a connection with someone when you're interviewing them. You know, you're making, because that's so you do your job. Like you get them to talk about, you get them to open up and talk about what has happened to them. Like even in the most banal story, you're trying to do that. And of course, that's what you do as well. But that's a kind of, that process definitely does affect you. You know, I think it has to.
You know, the sort of feeling of helplessness that there are other human beings here that, you know, they want the basics, but actually there's nothing really I can do apart from tell their story. So I thought about that for a long time afterwards, and I did go and speak to someone actually about it, just about, you know, that feeling of a bit of guilt in a way, that there was very little I could do to help them apart from film their story.
We went to a kind of a church in Natara, and it's a kind of memorial, but it was one of the worst massacres of the Rwandan genocide, and like thousands of people were taking shelter in this church, and they'd been surrounded, or they'd just gone in and killed everybody essentially, and you know, the bones are still there in the church. And at the back there was a place where there was really the Sunday school, and there was a wall, and all the kind of wee small kids, like 2, 3, 4 years old, had been in there, and they'd come in and they'd killed all the kids, and they had taken the kids, lots of these toddlers, by their feet and smashed their heads in off the wall, and you can still see it. There's still like bits of brain essentially and stuff on the wall, you know, and like I had nightmares about that wall, like for months afterwards. Like it just because it's such a how do you get more evil than that, you know? And I would wake up and I would see that wall kind of just, you know, and I mean, on the one hand you think, well, it should cost you something. I mean, it does. Like, I mean, sometimes if you're doing working on that, I mean, level of awfulness, then you know, I would be more worried if it didn't have an effect. But it did. But like, I mean, you know, like I say, I had nightmares about it for a long time, and then like last year, just before my wife had her first child, you know, I started having nightmares again about that. What just you know, because, you know, obviously, you know, having one child and stuff like that, it brought a lot of stuff to the surface, you know.
As a company, we take sort of mental health very, very seriously with helplines and support networks and things like that. You know, it's not something that you should feel embarrassed about feeling. You know, it's something we want to talk about, and you should feel able to raise, actually, that really affected me, and just to chat about it. So yeah, on an informal level, after a story we'll always check on people, but as a company there are also more formal arrangements to provide help for people, because, you know, things can happen and they can touch on things because of things that have happened in your own personal life. It can resonate more or less, so it's, you know, it's never making a judgment on, well, you shouldn't feel affected by that kind of thing.
I mean, one of the things is just, you know, part of the culture is you expect you to go on with it, you know, and I think that's, and certainly, you know, if you're dealing with this stuff all the time, you're going to have to, I mean, because it is more unusual for us, we've got someone out, one of my colleagues is out just a moment in kind of Bangladesh, you know, so, and actually thinking about this, I probably will say to him when he comes back, you know, do you need to talk to him, you know, and like, listen to the general stuff you would do personally, but when you go and talk to a professional and kind of may help you process that things, I mean, well, not he wants to do that, it's up to him, you know, but I think it's, you know, I think it's something you've got to be aware of, and also just from a kind of, just how, you know, utilitarian point of view, like I came back from that trip and I got back late on the Sunday and I went to work on the Monday, and I had a big shouting match with my then editor on the, you know, on the Monday night, and it was, I mean, just something absolutely stupid, but it was just because I was still, and it just processing all that stuff, and I just, you know, it just got really worked up, and we ended up having a big row, you know, and it was all fine in the end, you know, and she sent me home and all that, but I think you do have to be aware that if you're putting people through, if you're making people go to these dark places, you know, you have to give them a bit of space. You have to take that on board, you know.
After speaking to Ian and Suzanne, I set off to Edinburgh to talk to a print journalist, Kieran Andrews, and then to Belfast, where I met Mervyn Jess, a senior broadcast journalist with 41 years' experience who covered the Troubles in Ireland. Kieran discussed two stories he has covered in the past, and Mervyn reflected on one particularly harrowing story during the Troubles, where an RPG was fired at a police vehicle.
It pierced through the skin of the Land Rover and went inside, and when it gets inside, it just explodes and it just shreds everything inside the thing, and there's nowhere for the people inside to go. They're just, once it gets in, that's it. Well, I think it was about at least 3 officers killed.
I remember speaking to a woman whose partner had slashed her new boyfriend with a coat hanger before assaulting her so severely that she lost her eye.
But I remember being at the scene whenever the Land Rover was being taken away, and it was hooked onto the back of a pickup truck, and when the hook started to bring the Land Rover up, it obviously tilted up like that and was pulling it back up onto the back of this truck. And as it was going up at an angle at the back of the truck, the back doors of the Land Rover flew open, and this stream of blood just poured out the back. It was like a gravy boat being tipped, and you just thought, you know, there's what's left of those people who were inside it, albeit they're people in uniform, but they were still people. That was it. It just came out the back like a gravy boat.
The other area that really stuck with me was recently I went to Bosnia with the Remembering Srebrenica charity, and to speak to victims of the attacks, and to speak to women who were sexually assaulted, who were raped, who watched their husbands die.
So that's one thing. I know sometimes whenever you're pouring gravy, you remember that. It just comes into your head like that. A lot of bits and pieces, similar things. You see something, you have a smell about something, and you say, that smell brings back time I remember that. Every Remembrance Sunday, I remember getting the call in my ear. I was broadcasting live for the radio for downtown at the Santaf in Belfast to say, cut the broadcast short and get in the car and drive to Enniskillen. And I was sort of, why am I being told this in the middle of it? And then the engineer was saying, you have to go now. And I had to wrap the thing up on the air and say, what are you doing? He says, there's been an incident in Enniskillen, multiple casualties. You're the only person they can get the hold of because you're working today in this. Go. Every Remembrance Sunday, I remember the drive down to Enniskillen. And I was there, I think I was the first journalist from outside of Enniskillen. The local journalists down there obviously were there quicker, but I was certainly the first Belfast journalist to get there because I was on the road within minutes of us hearing about it. And then getting there and seeing the whole scene, which at that stage the bodies will have been lifted out of the rubble and casualties taken to the hospital, and then going to the hospital and all the stuff that was happening there with the doctors and nurses coming in, people flying about everywhere trying to deal with the casualties, and people being wheeled out in stretchers onto helicopters and flown out of the car park to be taken to Belfast for more specialist treatment. That remains with me every Remembrance Sunday. I always remember that, and will continue to do so.
And that's something that stays with you, to see the sort of impact, the sort of injury, and to have it in front of you, that physical trauma for them, that must leave an incredibly deep emotional scar on the victim. It also affects you as a person, because you're doing your job professionally as a journalist. But if these things don't affect you on a personal level, if you're not thinking about that later, then you're not doing your job properly, because you've got to feel this to a degree as well.
Well, you just get on with it, basically. Now, obviously, in the earlier days, you were seeing things for the first time, and then you saw it the next time, and it didn't have quite the same impact. The first time you could turn up somewhere where something really bad's happened, there's a body lying there, but maybe covered with some sort of a coat or maybe a tarpaulin, but there's usually a stream of blood running out of it down the street, and you see that for the first time, and you sort of, oh, but you see it the next time, you don't go as far back, and then eventually you sort of get a little bit, you adjust to it.
Yeah.
And you have to keep yourself detached somewhat, because you can't get emotionally involved with everything you go to, because you couldn't do your job properly. So that's the way you sort of build up an interior defence mechanism, an invisible wall between you and the reality. But the irony of it is you have to reflect the reality in your reporting. So even you put this wall up, you actually step over it to an extent to get at what the story is, to try and tell it in a way that will have an impact on the people you're telling it to. So it's a strange juxtaposition of things that, and really, people did it in different ways. I mean, black humour was a great thing for most of us in those days. I mean, in the blackest situation, you could find something which you just had to laugh at because it was just so dark.
I've never experienced anything severe that you put with people who are struggling with or have struggled with like PTSD or anything like that. I've never been anywhere close to that. But definitely have been things that, on a very, very low level, have certainly been left in moods or or shaken, not quite myself.
The only time I really did feel anything close to what we call, I don't know, the impact of what had happened affecting me and what I was doing was in Enniskillen, with the bombing there, because it wasn't so much just the bombing itself and covering it. I was there for about a week. I was sent down on that day, and I was there for the best part of a week to stay to do the funerals of a lot of the victims. And I think I did 7 funerals in about two or 3 days. And that's a lot of grief to watch, listen to, process through, going into churches, hearing things said by clergymen, by family members, watching what was happening at the funerals. I have to say that after about a week of that, I was ready for it to be brought out, and I was replaced by somebody else who came in, did fresh legs, if you like, to carry the story on to the next stage and do whatever remaining funerals needed to be done. That's a good move, because you can't stay in a thing too long, and then it does start to have an impact. But that was the first time I felt anything like that.
I think that journalism as a whole is employed by David Thompson, who are fantastically supported, but journalism as a whole could do with helping people in that situation, I think, a lot more, just about being more open.
Yeah, if you feel you've been traumatised with something, you can certainly be referred and get treatment for it. And they've had seminars, and we've been to them and done them, and someone will come in and tell you about, well, here are the indicators, and here are the signals to look out for. And so, and there are certain, I think we still have designated trauma counsellors who are some staff members who are trained up a little bit more on these things and know how to deal with a situation, at least initially, when something was to manifest itself. But we really haven't had, touch wood, that type of incident to deal with on a regular basis for some time now.
It's interesting to hear how trauma has affected each of these journalists differently, having had a more profound effect on some than it's had on others. Despite the fact that most of these journalists have built up support networks between their colleagues when it comes to tackling trauma, I felt it would be beneficial to seek out some people who help journalists deal with these issues professionally. It may sound like a very niche area, but I did manage to find an organisation called the Dart Centre, who help journalists when it comes to reporting on trauma, as well as how to deal with it on a personal level. I also caught up with Angelina Fusco, who runs trauma retreats for journalists, for which she has won awards. I caught up with Angelina while still in Belfast, and travelled down to London afterwards to speak to Gavin Rees, the Dart Centre's director. I wanted to find out more about what they do, as well as more about trauma in general and how they can help journalists.
Well, the Dart Centre is an organisation that provides resources and training for journalists who are working on stories about violence and trauma. So in other words, we give people advice, and it could be individual journalists or it could be news organisations, and the advice looks at how to work as effectively as possible on those kinds of stories. So sometimes people come to us because they're interested in finding out how to look after themselves and teams if they're exposed to trauma. Sometimes it's because they're thinking about how to do interviews with vulnerable contributors, in other words, people who've been affected.
I never heard the word journalism and trauma put together until the early 2000s when I was asked to go on a course, a pilot course in London for the BBC. And then we had some connection through another colleague of mine to the Dart Centre, who got an Ockberg Fellowship, and subsequently in 2012 I got an Ockberg Fellowship.
Journalists often say to themselves, it's not about me, it's about the people in the story, therefore my reactions don't matter at all. And of course, in a sense, it's true. If you're interviewing somebody who's been in a terrifying situation, for real, their experience is going to be much more adverse than your own. But the thing of constantly and always pushing away personal impact and saying, well, this isn't affecting me, it's got nothing to do with me, means that it can creep up and slowly accumulate. So if somebody's working on a story again about something like the Grenfell fire, it's a really good example, and they're interviewing 40 or 30 people who were there in the scene and tried to escape, that's fractions of 40 people's experience, and it starts to mount up.
So what I saw was that awareness of what actually physical trauma and mental trauma did to somebody could change how they answered questions, how they perceived the world, and we were just running in, dropping in, getting the clip and leaving again.
And so the only reason why you want to be aware of this stuff is not because, as a professional journalist, you want to go around screaming, what about me, I'm hurt too. That's not the point. The point is to work more effectively, because if people don't take stock of adverse trauma impact, it can have a really deleterious effect on the quality of their work, on their personal relationships. And so the work suffers. So one thing I often say to journalists who say, I don't really need to think about myself at all, it's not about me, is to say, well, that's right in a sense, is that the people in the story are more important, but it's vital that you look after yourself, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to tell those people's stories as effectively as you could do otherwise.
To look after your own self-care became very important to me. from the 2000s up until I left the BBC in 2013. And then subsequent to that is as a freelance trainer, independent trainer. And I do believe that trying to look after yourself, understanding what trauma does to your mind and your body, helps you then give a little bit more power back to the powerless when we're interviewing them, and also helps you look after yourself so that your journalism is good and strong, and that you have longevity, and that you don't end up being ill.
I think a lot of people in the industry don't really understand what resilience means, and they think that resilience in the face of trauma means not being affected by it at all in any sense. So in other words, it's the idea of the Teflon-coated reporter. It's a bit like a perfect recording machine. They go out into the world, they write down the facts, and it's got nothing to do with them. Well, that's a kind of nice model. It's based on sort of 19th century ideas of objectivity, but it's not actually true, as we all know, in the kind of common sense viewpoint, that if you're working on a particularly harrowing, traumatic story, it could be a story to do with domestic violence or child sexual abuse, most people are going to be affected by it in some way. And when I say affected, that doesn't mean that they're going to be rendered psychologically ill, if you like, affected with a capital A, but it means affected, at least affected by a small a. In other words, they're going to be challenged and stretched and find reporting on these stories really, really demanding.
I mean, I think the thing about it is, when I first went into journalism, you had a notebook and a pen and a photographer. That was in papers. When I joined the BBC, the first thing you got was a kind of 8-pound in weight reel-to-reel tape called a Euro, or you had a cameraman and a sound man and occasionally a lighting man. But the only people who saw those images and hear bits of bodies, terrible, what they witnessed was terrible, and injuries and those who have been killed in bombings and shootings, etc. They saw them. Other people didn't see them. As I left the BBC, I had just helped to introduce a whole new digital transformation in a newsroom. So somebody comes back in with a digital card and puts it into a hub. The hub, who are engineers, are seeing those images. All the people in BBC Northern Ireland could see those images right across radio and television. And so, you were seeing things that you didn't normally have to see. Also, colleagues of mine who worked in London, who were dealing with Iraq and Iran and Syria and the Arab Spring, were seeing just ordinary people, some of them interns coming through the door, researchers, because they were having to find out, was that piece of footage authentic? And they had to watch those things, beheadings, we didn't see those here, but people have seen those, and that stays in your head. It has to, because it's a shocking traumatic image.
Don't necessarily know or understand that those events aren't happening in the space around them. So what happens is that you kind of go into a trauma response mode, and that might involve focusing on narrow details of the imagery, becoming hyper alert to external threat. It's associated with a massive rush of adrenaline. Now, the really weird thing for a journalist in that situation is they're not actually there, so it's hard to recognise that it's happening, and it's sort of almost, strange or peculiar to be complaining about it. So people tend not to respond in a kind of effective way, and to understand that these are natural responses, and that there are certain things that one can do to lower one's levels of arousal and to work more effectively with that material.
People are really surprised to learn that trauma stays in the body. They think there's something wrong with them if they're feeling upset or depressed, but actually it's a physical happening event that happens in your body. And I've just done a 4-week course on the legacy of trauma in your body with the WAVE organisation here, and it was really fascinating. Even though through DART I knew some stuff, actually learning it with a wee bit more in-depth knowledge really surprises people. The
first thing to understand about trauma is that the body's traumatic stress responses are defence responses, and they kick in incredibly fast in a traumatic incident. And they're everything from like hyperarousal, which means being super, super alert, to dissociative numb feelings in which the brain kind of says, well, I'm probably going to do better in this situation if I pretend I'm not really here, I'm not really in it. And those are natural responses. So you'd expect most people in the wake of a traumatic incident to have those kinds of responses and various other ones. That doesn't mean that they're psychologically injured or psychologically damaged in any way at all. The problems arise when those immediate reactions don't subside. And so if 4 weeks after a traumatic incident, people are still kind of locked in that state, then that's a sign that something more concerning or worrying has happened.
You know, most of the big organisations, I mean, we never talked about it. We just went to the pub, people got drunk, people smoked far too much. You know, people didn't, you know, journalists, men and women, did not want to go home to their families and tell people what, you know, tell their loved ones what they saw. So they held it in. So mostly the BBC Club was a great outlet for people getting absolutely, you know, drunk, and it went out of their memories, and then they got up the next day. You know, very few people, I mean, I'm not saying it was never spoken about, but you didn't generally say, how's your mental well-being today, or that must have been awful. You might have said, you know, that must have been awful today, and somebody would have said, yeah, and then brushed it off.
It's not really about opening up in the sense of sitting around in a circle and being forced to say just how bad things are or how challenging you find things. Well, because lots of people don't want to talk publicly about these things. They don't want to talk about personal impact issues. But it's at least finding an outlet and a way of processing and working these things through. For lots of people, talking about these things publicly is really helpful. And there are certain ways that you can have that conversation in public, which is to say that this is a conversation between professionals in which we're trying to learn lessons learned from the experience, what worked well, what didn't work so well, how did you manage issues around emotional impact. That's quite safe for people. People can have those kinds of conversations without feeling that they're forced to kind of, you know, open their hearts in a complete way, or bare their chest in a way that might be uncomfortable for them.
You know, newsrooms are not great places to. I mean, you wouldn't go into a newsroom and say, oh, you know, I feel awful, I feel really shocked about yesterday. But what there needs to be in a newsroom are identifiable people who have some training, who that you can go to and that you feel comfortable, and it's not your boss, but it is. There's social support there. That at least if someone says, God, what I had to listen to yesterday or what I saw yesterday was, you know, I didn't sleep. I mean, the important thing is to know is that journalists are resilient because they want to be doing it. Photographers are resilient, they want to do it, they want to tell the story. So actually, it's okay to feel a bit crap for a couple of days.
I mean, you can't really stop terrible things happening. The question is how well prepared you are to face them, and if you get into difficulties, what you can do to get yourself out of them.
Following my chat with Angelina and Gavin, I realised that it's largely the macho culture in journalism that often prevents reporters from speaking up about work-related trauma. However, it's great to see that there are indeed people out there who specialise in helping journalists deal with these issues, through both preemptive measures as well as support following these traumatising incidents. At the same time, I have a newfound respect for journalists who are willing to put their own mental well-being on the line in order to provide exclusive stories to the public, which in turn often makes society a better place.